Today I want to create a function in Power Query which will handle this situation where I have multiple values stored in the same column and they have some kind of separator between them and I need to split them into multiple columns. And right now it would be very simple to do so if I go under transform, split column, and I can say by delimiter comma, but this isn't exactly future proof. The way the function works is it has automatically typed in my new column headers and it's decided what they should be called. The original column was called value, so the new ones are called value dot and then 1, 2, 3 and so on. But in the future, what if I had more than 3 values? So I can emulate that by simply adding a new row. Right after the change type step, I'm going to add a new row, which is simply called D, and this has now 5 commas. So when this function splits the value column and it only has 3 names here, that produces a problem because the next values are now forgotten. And I can solve that somewhat by simply manually adding new columns, but now I can see here I actually forgot to add an extra column on purpose here. So I would need to manually add new column names inside of the function, which isn't exactly future proof. Because again, in the future, I could add a new row which has even more values. Let's say in the future I get a new data set which only has 4 values in the same column, then I'd end up with 2 leftover columns that I'd need to deal with somehow. One option to get around this is that there's an optional argument I can pass in, where instead of adding in the column headers as names, this is a list of the values, I can instead add a number. In this case that would be 6 without the curly bracket, and it would then create 6 columns. So if I can create a function that would calculate how many new columns I have to add, then I can substitute this value with that variable. So that is the first solution, which isn't the final solution, but it's a part of the puzzle. So if I delete the splitting, I can create a part 2 where I do this solution, where I can calculate the number of delimiters I have. I first want to show this by adding a new column to make it more visual. What I want to do is to use text select to only have the part of the value column that's my delimiter. And in this case, I'm going to hard code it as a comma, which you could choose to make that variable. But right now, let's just do it this way. Then I can say I want to count the number of characters. In other words, get the length of this text, which will then be the number of commas. And then I have to add 1 to this because this has 6 values and 5 commas in between, which means that when I split this by delimiter, it will create 6 columns. But I can then do the max of this column. That's because I'm under add column, so that's me being silly. If I go under statistics and that was not sum, I want to find the max of this column and then I want to add 1 to that. So this is the number of columns I need to add. And I can of course do this in one step instead of doing it in multiple. So if I take this code to begin with, and then I can say upon this table, I want to extract that custom column, the one I add, and then I want to do the List.Max and add 1. I can do exactly that. And then this is a table and not my list. So I need to say I want to grab that custom column and then I want to add 1 to that. And then I have too many parentheses. And actually it's because I forgot to add the text length because I added that as an individual step. Now my parentheses work as well. That will be the number of columns that I need as my variable. And then I can go back here and say that I wanted to split that column. And then I just need to change up the order. And then I don't want this change type step because this will now be dependent on both the name of the original column that I split and also the number of columns. So I don't want that to be hard coded. And then the only thing I want to change is here, instead of passing in a list of column names, I want to pass in the number of columns. And then again, delete the change type step. But now I end up with these headers that I'm not a fan of, and I want to fix that using list accumulate. And again, this isn't the final solution. This was just me working through the process. So I'm going to cheat a bit and copy in the code. Here I've simply said, okay, this is the original name. And actually it shouldn't be called value1. It's simply value. That's the original column header. And then it adds a dot and then the number in order to differentiate them. And then to actually fix the column headers, I want to transform the column names, where that is my split column by delimiter step. And the function I want to apply is then for each column header, I want to do list accumulate to say my list is the list accumulate source. And then the current header is the starting value. And my function is then if the state, so the current column header that I'm iterating through, if that's equal to the value on the left in my list, which is then the value dot whatever, then I want to replace the value with current one. Otherwise, I want to return the original value. And then I messed up the brackets. So that's all fine and dandy. But this is still hard-coded because this list accumulate source has the same problem as before, which is where I need to manually make sure that this list of lists is long enough. Because if I need to create 10 columns, then this setup will fail. So it's not actually future-proof. It's just a bit better than what it was before. But this has all of the steps that I need. I have two variables. I need to know what the column header is that I want to split. And I need to know what the delimiter is. And I can figure out what the number of columns is using this calculation. So that's not a problem. And I can use list.Generate in order to generate this list of lists. And again, the number of rows will then be equal to the number of columns. So this is variable, but something I can easily calculate. So I already have all of the ingredients I need to create the function. Normally, when you want to create a function, you'd want to use parameters, meaning that when you then convert it from a query into a function, you'll establish a link between the two, meaning you can change the query and that will change the function, which makes debugging a lot easier.
Foreshadowing is a literary device.
It's also easier to create the function and eventually change it. But I want my function to take a table as its input, and you can add that as a parameter type. You can only have single values, which means I'll have to create the function as a query and then manually convert that into a function afterwards, which makes things a bit more complicated, but it's not too troublesome because my function won't have many steps.
Foreshadowing.
Actually, the only thing I need to change for this part 2 in order to create my finalized function is that I want this step, rather than simply being a manual list I've created, I want to use list.Generate in order to create the list that has both the original value and the fixed value. And then afterwards, when I convert that into a function, I'll need to make the column header be a variable. So if I copy this in order to be able to go back, what I want is to generate a list which has a number of rows equal to the number of columns variable that I have here in a step. And I need to create a list of lists where the first value is the original column header and the second value is the next value. And again, the format is very simple. It takes the original column that gets split, adds a full stop, adds an incrementing number. So I simply have to take that into account, which means my function needs to have an iterable in order to tell when the loop has to end. But what it actually spits out is these two values, which sounds complicated, but it really isn't. So I want to generate a list, and I want its initial value to be 1, because I know that the first column name is then the original name, full stop, and a 1. And I want to keep looping as long as the current value, that is my iterable value, is equal to or less than the number of columns. And then for each loop, I want my next iterable value to be its current value plus 1. But what I actually want to print, and I don't like the name selector because that's not what it is. It's simply what I print as my value, is that for each item, I want to create a list, so curly brackets, where the first value should be value, because right now this is hard-coded and I have to change that afterwards. And then I need to add not the value of my iterable, but instead the text converted value. So right now it's a number and now it becomes text. And then the second value is split, and you could optionally also make this variable, which I'll show how to do. And likewise also text from underscore. So now I have 6 rows and this follows the format that I want. So that's fine and dandy. And that was the only change I had to make. Again, to repeat, I actually only have 2 variables. I have the header for the column to be split up and the delimiter because everything else gets calculated. But I can now take this query and convert that into a function. So if I go into advanced editor and copy this, it's something that you really need to keep calm when you do this. Otherwise, if you alt tab while you have this text in, PowerQuery tries to convert it into literal string, and I don't want that. But I wanted a function, so I need something up here. So equals, I want some parameters, which is my table, because I want to convert the original table into a new table. So that's the data type table. And then a column name, which is text, and then a separator. And optionally, you could also add here, what should the new column name be? But let's just write the function first and then worry about it. So the output is a table, and then I have the let. Then I need to make sure that source is not part 1, it is my table. And I don't remember if I refer to it elsewhere. I do there. So this is where it's a bit tricky to manually change these values. Here I see a comma, and that should be my separator. Actually, I also need that there. So I will probably mess this up somewhere and then have to debug it. And that's fine, and that's fine. And then this needs to be the new column name. And then this is the only part where you'd need to change. If you wanted to add the new column header as a parameter, you'd need to change that here, because it's taken care of inside of the list accumulator. So if I did everything right, then I can simply call this function, and let's try that out. So it should be part 1, and it was called value, and my separator is a comma. And then that definitely messed up because it didn't actually change the column headers. And I can see here, I put quotation marks around my column name, which means it thinks that's the literal text and not referring to the parameter. And this is sometimes a problem when you create a function where, for instance, you want to refer to a column header and not the text. So if I want to refer to my column name value, I'm not referring to the text value, but the column header. That might be something I need to take into account. In order to test my function here to figure out what's going wrong, what I can do is add the variables as steps and then delete the portion here where it says it's a function, because now when it refers to these keywords, it will refer to the local variables. So this should work. And then I forgot my let because I copied this whole thing as one step, and then I can see it's still not happy. It's still giving me the wrong column headers. I can definitely see one place where I messed up is that here when I'm adding my new columns to calculate the number of columns, I hard-coded the column header as value where I want that to be variable. And now I can see that it's messing up even more. What I can try to do is to avoid referring to the column name this way. So what I want to do is, instead of adding a new column, as I do in this part of the step, what I instead want to do is to convert the original column, because then I can refer to the column header by name in quotation marks rather than in the curly brackets. And I can use the table transform column function to do that. But that does mean I have to rewrite it inside of this code, which is a bit more difficult. So I want to instead transform the column instead of adding a new. I'm still applying it on the source step. Then instead here, I need to add a list of the transformations I want to perform, which is then I want to apply it on the column name, which is in quotation marks, so I can refer to it this way. And then my transformation is then the function that I used before, where I just need to say not this, because I'm now referring to the current value, so an underscore. And then I probably have too many parentheses. And actually I was missing a parentheses, but not a normal parentheses, because this is a list. So I need to figure out where I have to place that. That should be here. And I think I can remove one parentheses or two, because that is the transform columns. So I definitely need two here. Yeah. And then I'm no longer referring to the custom column. I'm now referring to the column name, but I can refer to it in curly brackets with my column name as a variable, because that doesn't work. Yeah, it can't find this, because it thinks that my column name is the literal name of the column and it isn't a variable. And what I can do instead is that I can use the table.column function like so to say, right now it's just for illustration purposes. I can now refer to the column as text. So let's say split comma 1. And that then spits out a list. So this is a way to get around saying custom 1 and then square brackets, name of the column. So I will be doing that. Yeah, so I can't refer it like this with the square bracket, but what I can say is I want to do List.Max on this, but then I need another step, which is then to say table.column, and then I can grab this, and the column that I then want, actually no, I need to do this, and then I want to refer to the column, which is then called my column name, and then a comma. Yeah, so now I'm saying List.Max, and I want to use table.column to convert my column inside of my table into a list, because I need to refer to the column name by a string and not with the square brackets, because then it doesn't understand that it needs to grab the actual column and not convert this into literal text. And then this is still mad. Yeah, so try to avoid writing functions this way, because it's much harder to fix later on. Then I can see here I also hard-coded the column, which should be my column name instead as a variable. And actually I think I need my +1 to be inside of the list, because this generates a new value and not outside, because that doesn't make much sense. I moved around some of the parentheses because I realized that my List.Max here needs to be applied upon the table column, which is then applied upon this to have 2 parentheses at the end here. And then we can check if it works. And it still doesn't fix the column headers, so I'm not done. And I can see here the reason why it doesn't work is that my column name, I forgot to add the full stop, which I did here, because I wanted this to be variable. And when I created the hard-coded version, I manually added the full stop. I need to add that full stop, and then I can add the number. Then we can see if it wants to work, and this looks fine. Yeah. Again, try not to write functions like this in one go, because it usually messes up. The big trick is when you want to refer to a column name, Power Query has a hard time knowing if you refer to the literal text or if you want to refer to the column itself. That is the square brackets. So one of the functions to get around that would be transform columns, because it refers to the column name in quotation marks, so as text, which is then converted to a column. And then I had to use the table column function here to specifically refer to a column and turn that into a list. And I'm sure there are other options too. And like I said, you could optionally add another variable to the function, which would make the new columns have a different name than just split, dot, and then a number. So if we copy this before I make any changes, you could make this optional as well if you really want to. But for now, let's just do it this way, making it a mandatory argument, because I just want to show how you do that. So the only place we actually need the new column name is here. That was my new header name. And then remember the full stop, and then I need to add that. You could add that this should be an optional argument. Then you could say that down here, where you create the new names, you'd have to say that if the new header name is not null, then do this, because then you actually enter the value. And if the value is equal to null, then you just need to add in whatever, some kind of hard-coded value. So this is if you want to do it this way, because if you don't pass in that value, it should just crash because you actually need it even though I said it's optional. So this is something you could decide to do if you want to, but then you need to account for that being optional. So I'm going to leave it like this. So